and I've got the YouTube up on my TV too, so I can also double check that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So it says we're live. I think there's a little bit of a delay on YouTube. Would give it a second to see if it.
Imagine there's a delay. You're in California, I'm in Scotland.
I know. Well, that's the other amazing thing about all of this technology, right?
Yes, indeed.
Definitely doing a much better job of connecting with folks. I was decent at it before, but I'm doing a much better job of connecting with folks all over the world. Now that we're all locked down and we're all talking on video anyway.
Hi.
So, all right, it looks like it's rocking and rolling. So let me give a little bit of an introduction to folks who are viewing this live and or might view this later. So I created a survey sometime in April about, and in full transparency, the survey really was a lot about which direction I wanted to take event integrity. I had acquired this company from a friend, and I knew that there was definitely big problems in our industry that I had identified, like where were all the opportunities, right? Where event integrity could play a role. And so, not only just how can I help the industry, but then also just kind of taking the pulse of folks in our industry and how they were thinking about things. Those were the goals of the survey, and looking at, bigger picture structures and systems and things like that. So I just closed down the survey and have done a deck that we'll walk through today on the results of that. I invited the folks who responded to the survey and chose to give me their email address, just to acknowledge that they responded to the survey. I invited them today to join us actually on video to talk through some of these results. So Joe is with us today as one of the people that responded to the survey. Joe, do you want to take a second and introduce yourself to the viewers?
Sure. Good morning, California time. Good evening, Scotland time. My name is Professor Joe Goldblatt, and I'm based in Edinburgh, Scotland. For 30 years, I was a university professor. I created the first undergraduate, postgraduate program in events management at George Washington University back in the early 90s. I'm the author of 37 books in the field of event management.
37? That's amazing.
Well, I had a lot of help. I had a lot of help.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. Yeah, well, I'm so glad that you're here because I think that, given that perspective, and what's great about this is Joe and I don't really know each other. I mean, we've interacted a bit on a Facebook group and things like that. So I think this will be a lot of fun, just you and I getting to know each other and giving, some different perspectives on what, like I said, the systems and structures that make up our industry. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here and chat through this with me. So let's go through. This is make sure it's like switching over there. I think it's switched back. Okay, here we go. I'm glad I've got the YouTube up on my screen to kind of monitor what's actually showing to verify that it's what I want to be showing on the screen. So the survey itself, we had 56 folks who responded. And like I said, I started it in April. I just took it down. And the top categories of the people that responded were full-time organizers. They were decision makers as far as, the specific phrasing was like, are you the one that decides whether or not an event happens? They were a lot of speakers and facilitators, folks who do exhibit at events, and then also vendors and suppliers. There was a lot of other categories, but these were the top 5. So I feel like it really provides a fairly diverse set of voices within our industry. So all types of folks that make up the industry, and a decent number. So one of the first questions that we asked was, and I'll read you the specific question is, how much journalistic value do you get from events industry media? And then I, listed some specific examples, and really overwhelmingly more. Well, not really overwhelmingly, it's kind of an interesting split because yes, there's more numbers on the side of mostly sponsored content than there are on the side of asks the tough questions, but the most responses were, kind of towards the middle, towards, ask the tough questions. So if I did, some rough kind of, weighing of extreme responses versus middle responses, I would say most people would say that most of the content that we consume is like sponsored content, and fewer people say that our media actually asks the tough questions. I will note though that a couple people in a follow up kind of question did mention specifically Skift and the Event Manager blog and BTN, which I think was a part of North Star, as ones that they felt like provided value. But a lot of the comments were, just some to do with people are feeling overwhelmed, right? Like there's just a lot of content out there, and we don't even get to it all. And I think one of the opportunities is curation of that content. So what do you think, Joe, about just kind of the state that we're in, as far as the media that's here to support us and provide resources to the industry? What are your feelings on it?
Well, I suppose you're talking about trade journals. Is that correct? Those journals that are solely to support the supply and demand factors in the meetings and events industry. So if that's the focus of the question, there has always been a historic bias towards asking softball questions because they're dependent on advertiser revenue. That said, I think there are beacons of hope within that industry. You see them occasionally through editorials. You see them occasionally through guest columnists like Joan Eisenstadt. But generally, because of the supply and demand factor, Elizabeth, they will always skew towards more lightweight analysis because they don't want to lose their advertisers.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, and I think that is, and I don't know if there's an opportunity in there somewhere, but yes, I think I completely agree. That is why we end up, with what we have, because they need those advertising dollars. That's the business model, right? And
Well,
I
the
think,
only opportunity would be if people started to read again. But unfortunately, people do not read. They read in nanoseconds. That's why if you ask most young people under the age of 25 where they get their news, they will say from their daily Twitter feed.
mhm,
That is not news as far as I'm concerned. That's not content. It's not context. But because of people being time poor, everything being in a rush because of the burdens of work and family and so on, people quickly glimpse, and as long as the world hasn't ceased to be, they move on with their day. But in terms of deep analysis, I don't think there's much of a market for that right now. Now, the obvious difference would be in higher education. In the field that I worked in for 30 years, all of our students were required to read refereed journals. So they
mhm,
had to actually read for content, for context, for historical perspective. They had to read with rigor to make sure that the sample survey was large enough and well stratified and so on. But the general public, no, I think in fact, I've just read an interesting book called Breaking News, and it's
mm,
about the Guardian newspaper between the years of 19, I think it was 1990, early 1990, and 2020, the last 30 years. And it talks about how there's a blending now, even in traditional newspapers, of online versus uh, newspaper content, and the online wins over and over and over again. And of course, the problem with online is no one wishes to pay for it. The
yeah.
advertising model doesn't work. Um, the subscription model doesn't work. So these publications are struggling.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, yeah, and you're right. We see that everywhere in that in the publishing industry, in the media industry. So I think that there's, I've seen some creative solutions outside of our industry, and so we'll see, if anybody decides to pick up that challenge and run with it. So the other thing we asked about were events industry certifications. This one, similarly, it was kind of an interesting mix. More people decided to answer in the middle, one way or the other. But the question was, how important are events industry certifications when you're hiring a contractor, an employee, or a vendor, right? So any kind of hiring decisions that you're making, folks that are helping you with your events. Um, 7 people did say that they considered them to be one of the top criteria, but I would say this shows a pretty significant, shift on the other side, just saying other factors are more important. And so I know that the CMP is definitely the most widely recognized certification, but outside of our industry, I think it's continued to struggle to have that relevance and have it be something that people really look to, like this person knows what they're talking about. So Joe, do you think that our certifications lack in, like, is it the content, is it actually the subject or the content of what they're training people to do and certifying people in, or do you feel like they're just perceived as having, they're maybe not rigorous enough, or again, it's kind of just another pay to play situation? Like, what's your take on it?
Well, I'll tell you a funny story, Elizabeth. About 40 years ago, when I wrote my first textbook, I did a speaking tour of Great Britain. And at the end of every presentation, I would urge the members of the audience to to get certified. Go out and get yourself certified.
Yep.
Well, the program organizer came up to me at the tea break and she said, Joe, do you notice the eyes of the people when you say, go get yourself certified? I said, no, not really. She said, you've terrified them. In Britain, to be certified means to be put inside the
Right.
mental hospital. So America is much more adept at creating, delivering these certification programs because there's more demand for it. It's a much bigger marketplace, etc. In Britain, we do certify people we provide qualifications, post undergraduate, postgraduate, Chartered Institute of Accountants, which is similar to your CPA in the
Mhm.
United States. We'll have a chartered marketing professional, chartered human resource professional, etc. And those do require requalification every few years. But you mentioned the CMP. The interesting thing about the CMP is the thousands and thousands of people that have that qualification, uh, when they apply for other posts, the statistics show that their starting salary offer or their graduated salary offer is usually several £1,000s higher than those who do not have a CMP. So
Mhm.
I've always believed the more you learn, the more you can earn, that education and qualifications still matter. Finally, I created the Certified Special Events Professional for what was then the International Special Events Society. Now it's the International Live Events
Mhm.
Association, 32 years ago. And when we created that, we studied the only other certification at that time, which was the CMP.
Mhm.
And we realized that the CMP was a very good exam theoretically. There was a multiple choice component, an experience component, but there was no component that really tested, to me, where the rubber hits the road in the management, the design, the evaluation of live events, and that's analysis. Analysis. So
Mhm.
what we require of the CSEP is so many years experience. Then secondly, a multiple choice exam, which is mostly linguistic. It's the key terminology in the industry. There's a
Right.
hundred questions on that exam, and then the third part, which is the differentiator between the other certification programs, is it requires you to actually produce an event on paper. You're given a blueprint to study of the key factors, success factors, best practices in event management, and
Mhm.
then you're given a case study, and you actually have to write a um, a business plan or an action plan, a dossier, if you will, of a live event. And that's
Mhm.
reviewed by blind review by three other people who hold that designation. So I think these uh, certifications have to become more rigorous in the future. But I would just say, in conclusion on this topic, the single most important factor in my mind is experience. I always told my students that if they graduated top of their class and their CV said that they had the highest honors, and so on the stack of CVs that came across my desk as a hirer, as an employer, they were at the very top. That wouldn't be enough. I would want to see their CV also show me that with experience, they were even higher than their education. And that means that from their freshman year, they started volunteering. Their sophomore year, they had a part time job. Their junior year, they had a semi full time job. Their senior year, they might be working almost full time. If someone can demonstrate that kind of progressive experience,
Mhm.
that is much more valuable to me and to the employers that I surveyed over the years with various studies than simply a mark given for learning in a classroom.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that kind of gets to the question here. People saying it's one of the top criteria. Are you getting feedback on your end, or am
Nope,
I
I'm
just
fine.
okay?
One of the challenges with measuring experience is how do you measure experience?
Right.
In there is something called grand rounds. That's where a junior doctor goes with a senior doctor to the bedside, and the senior doctor can say to the junior doctor, okay, here are the symptoms. What is your diagnosis? What is your prognosis? We don't have such an opportunity. When I created the event management certificate program at George Washington University, we actually had a module, a course called Grand Rounds, where I would take students to live events and I would say, look at that lighting rig. How would you improve that practice? Look at that table setup. How would you improve that
Mhm.
practice? Look at that stage design, the audio quality coming from the lectern. How would you improve that practice? And I think that's a very good way to promote real time learning. The problem is it's expensive. You're talking about small groups of people. And for these programs to be financially viable, they need big numbers. And that's why the CMP exam is so systemized and regimented, and hundreds of people can go through it, in a given year.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Awesome. This is great. This is great feedback that you're providing for us. Let's talk about, we've kind of touched a little bit on business models and things, but let's actually talk about transparency, because that comes into play when we're talking about these different business models. So the question specifically was, how do you feel about transparency in the events industry business transactions? And keep in mind, right, we had a decent mix of planners and suppliers, definitely more planners and suppliers, but there was a good mix of all types of people. And this one clearly shows that people think that pricing, budgets, commissions, and fees should be made available earlier in the process, versus pricing, budgets, commissions, and fees should not be made available, like not disclosed, or not until absolutely necessary. So I think this is clearly one of our biggest opportunities, because so much of our industry, I'm going to say, is in the dark, right? Like kind of, what, and I think this would go such a long way in elevating and, showcasing what our value actually is, right? If people actually pay you for your time or for your expertise, kind of like we were talking about before, for your work, it's not kind of like, oh, my service is free because someone else is paying for it, right? Is one of the models that or I'm just going to mark up all of the vendors that I'm providing for you, but you don't actually really know what you're paying for any of that, right? All of this is kind of, we've just shoved it into the dark corner, right? And so folks don't even know, really what they're paying for. So I think this is a huge opportunity. I'll give a couple specific examples though. We're seeing it more with event technology companies, but having your pricing right on your website, like, hey, this is how much this thing costs. I think that's definitely something that clients want to see. They don't want to have to call you and have a whole conversation with you only to find out that it's nowhere near what they can afford. And on the flip side, and I've been a planner and a supplier, so I appreciate both sides. But I know that our supplier friends are saying, well, but the planners don't tell us what their budget is, and so we can't also optimize our services based on their budget. So I think that this, it was surprising to. I'm happy to see that so many people answered this so strongly in that direction. But I mean, the way we do everything in this industry says otherwise. So what do you think about all this, Joe?
Well, I think one size, Elizabeth, doesn't fit all. What may work in North America would not work at all in Europe. I'll give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started doing business in Europe 40 years ago, I noticed that people, when they went to association meetings, didn't have the transparency, the camaraderie. They looked at everyone in the room as a competitor. So they
Mm-hmm.
kept their cards very close to their chest.
Yeah.
Whereas in America, you go to a meeting, you have a few drinks, somebody says, how do you do that? How do you charge? What do you do? Etc. It's much more open in terms of an environment. As far as listing prices on a website, I think what's important to remember, and maybe I'm biased because I owned an event management company for 20 years before I went into higher education, events are not commodities. They're not like buying and selling refrigerators or even laptop computers, etc. Most events are bespoke. They're customized, for the need of the client. So I think it's okay to put some costs up on a website, but I've always found that value takes the day. So if you have the highest reputational value and your pricing is also perceived as a good value within the industry. People don't buy on price. Maybe they do with commodity items like audiovisual, um, uh, pipe and drape, things that are easy to compare and contrast. But if you have that unique spark of creativity, if you're the most confident choice for a client because they really need to know you're going to be the person standing backstage holding the hand of that speaker before they walk onto the platform. Um, I don't believe they assign a price to that. Now, that doesn't mean there's not an overall budget. There is an overall budget, and I think there should be greater transparency on the client side. For example, I would always say to students when I was discussing price that it was important to say to a client, could you tell me what range your budget is? You don't have to tell me the exact budget, but range. And they
Mm-hmm.
would say, well, this is private information. We can't share this.
Right.
And then I would say, well, let me give you an example of another similar type event. What do you think they paid for that event? And they would give me an amount. And I would say, is your event similar to that one? So there's a way to back in to finding out what the budget range is because it's a wasted discussion and a
Right.
wasted um, effort if you don't have some boundaries with regards to respecting the client's budget. Then, of course, I produced the opening of Donald Trump's Taj Mahal Casino in Atlantic City back in the 1990s. When you're working for a company that literally prints money, you never offend them by asking, what's your budget? You instead paint a dream and let them say, that's a lovely dream. Can you make it a little bit bigger?
Yeah.
So, whatever the budget is, you add options.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I think that we're going to see a lot more calls for transparency and incentivizing companies just to be more transparent, right? I mean, that we just see this in society. Just I think there's going to be a shift, and we'll get into this maybe a little bit more with some of the other questions, but a shift towards more authenticity and transparency. So I'm in that regard, I'm not surprised to see the responses come in where they did on that. So I guess kind of related to that, I guess I just gave myself a nice little segue there.
Mhm.
On this idea of authenticity and transparency, we've got okay. So the question was: is your company committed to creating better relationships with your employees, your customers, and your vendors? And I think that I'll just highlight one of the responses I got to the follow up to that. And this person said, "I believe it's important, but think high and abrupt turnover has caused relationships to be weaker than they could be or should be." So that would be, obviously talking about relationships with their vendors. I would take that to mean. So, what was your take on this first, Joe? And then we can talk a little bit more about it.
Well, there was a wonderful book by Pine and Gilmore about authenticity. They're the authors of the now I've lost the title of their first book that is so famous.
Was
The
it the
one that
experience economy?
Thank you, The Experience Economy. Their follow-up book
Ding ding
was
ding! I
called
get, I get a point for
Yeah,
that.
there you go. You get an A for that. The
Right.
follow-up book was called Authenticity,
Oh,
and the book didn't do as well as The Experience Economy. And I think the reason is because you and I both know, Elizabeth, you can't teach authenticity. You either have it or you don't. And one of the challenges for developing an authentic persona today is just what we're doing right now. When you're not able to sit across the table and have a drink with someone or to share intimate war stories from meetings and events, it's hard to build that relationship. So I think in the future there will be a lot more of this StreamYard, Zooming, Skype to build relationships. It'll take a wee bit longer. Um, the interesting thing is, again, in one size doesn't fit all, in Asia, as you probably know, no one asks for the business on the first date. Whereas in America, this was my experience every time. You
right.
ask for the business right away. In Asia, you have drinks, you then have dinner another night, then maybe you go to a meeting, and after about the fourth or fifth meeting, then the client brings up the question of, would you be available? Are you interested? May I invite you to submit a proposal, etc. So I think the Asian model gives us a lot to learn.
hmm Yeah, and I think going back to just how our society is shifting to I've really honed in on this concept of stakeholder capitalism, right? So versus just, and this would be publicly traded companies for the most part, but versus the focus on your short-term shareholder profits, it's what am I doing to take care of my community, all of my stakeholders, essentially, right? So your employees, your customers, your vendors, right? Treating them all like they are actually humans, because guess what, they are, even though we sometimes tend to forget that. And doing what's right for them, helping them, helping them show up in an authentic way, right? So it's I think this is definitely a trend that we can all capitalize on. And a lot of the folks in the follow up to this particular chart talked about our business being a people business. Like, hey, we're in a people business, so of course I'm committed to these relationships. But I think, as you and I, alluded to a little bit more, I think sometimes those relationships, especially between planners and suppliers, that vendor relationship, I think it can be a little bit more strained than we like to admit and we like to talk about. Lacking some trust there as well. But
Okay, I'm
yeah,
gonna I'm
so
gonna bring up I'm gonna bring up something. Pardon me for interrupting you.
no, you're fine.
That is quite controversial, perhaps. I think authenticity in some situations is overrated. I'll give you an example.
Okay.
Because of the pandemic, it is unlikely that when you go to a hotel in the future, you will meet an individual upon check-in. You'll do a touchless check-in. You'll do a touchless room entry. You
Yep.
will not have maid service on a daily basis. Um, you won't have a concierge. In other words, this isn't an excuse for corporations to reduce the number of employees because
Mhm.
with employees, you have payroll, you have pension, you have benefits, you have health care, and more importantly, you have insecurity because sometimes they don't show up. So
Right.
I think you'll see more robotic, automated activity in the meetings and events area. And what human beings will do is what machines cannot do, and that is creative, innovative solutions because we still have, at least for now, the greater ability to use our creative side, our emotional side of the brain to produce beautiful meetings and events.
Mhm.
And so I think when we use the term authenticity or stakeholder capitalism, we have to remember that in the post COVID world, it's probably going to change significantly. And once hotels start eliminating posts, do you think they'll bring them back? Highly unlikely, because as you say, these are public companies driven by profit and they will continue to operate as long as they can with as little cost as possible. And the highest cost in the hospitality and tourism industry is people. So I think there'll be less people, more machines, more robots, and the people that are remaining have to have the ability to creatively problem solve, to innovate, to create the guest experience in a way that is competitive or they'll be gone too.
Yeah. 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 I don't know how controversial that is. I agree with everything you just said.
Okay.
I think that is I think that is our very, soon to be reality. Quite frankly, I'm surprised, you've seen some hotels kind of dipping their toe into that water, right? Like I'm surprised it took this disruption, I think, for this to happen. And I think it will. I had a question in the survey about, I think I didn't include it because I think I worded it like, the best that I could have, but it was around this idea of, how many more things could we automate, right? So yeah, I'm definitely, thinking a lot about automation and, robots and AI and all these other technologies that, quite frankly, should have probably disrupted our industry more than they have already. But now, like, now it's the perfect opportunity for these hotels to do that. And I will add, as much as we need to figure out what are the housekeepers, what are these front desk folk gonna do when their jobs get replaced by robots, like that's something, that's concerning. But at the same time, especially in the US, and I think applies everywhere, those folks aren't getting paid in a lot of cases a living wage anyway, right? And so I think that's, again, a wider issue, right? Our society needs to take care of, but it's very specific also to our industry. So I think that's, having those relationships with those folks is, also just taking care of them when they are your employee. So I think that's something we should, dig into more in the Facebook group and in other channels. So somewhat related, and this, and it also falls under this idea of stakeholder capitalism, companies that are making statements, and this is not new to, Black Lives Matter, which would have applied to the other slide, but, companies have been making statements for a while around this idea that they're, committed to their communities, and that oftentimes includes climate change. They're saying that, we are going to take responsibility for, our role. So my question was, is your company committed to reducing its impact on the environment, on the planet? We got a little bit fewer responses on the yes than we did on the last question. Are they committed to relationships? And most of the responses, so this was a little surprising to me. Most of the responses to the follow-up to this pointed to cost or budget. And quite frankly, I thought we had moved. I thought that we had educated our industry at least to the point where we had convinced most people that they could save money by going green in a lot of cases, right? There's a lot of sustainability efforts that you could make that would actually save you money, right? So, but I'm not sure that we have, based on the responses I got here. A lot of folks saying they don't do it because it costs more. And then there's the other issue of the comment I pulled out here was, I don't always believe that venues are operating honestly when they say they are. Often conservation efforts touted by hotels are more designed to save expenses than to prevent climate change or damage to the environment. And so this ties back into that question, that topic about authenticity. People want companies to do the right thing for the right reasons, right? Like, I think, hey, if we can get them to do the right thing, like, that's a step, right? Like, that's good. That's a good goal. But I think in the future, going back to, transparency and authenticity, that's not going to be good enough anymore. People want to know that you're doing it because you care, like, you're not doing it just to save money. So, what was your response to this, Joe, or what do you think about the how the responses came in?
Well, and I'm not surprised because, again, in capitalism, people will make a decision based upon the bottom line. And although we may use all kinds of formulas to demonstrate that the bottom line actually improves when you have a greener economy, it's a cultural shift as well to get owners, operators, investors to realize this is not a short term commitment, it's a long term commitment. And most people look for short term results. Elizabeth, in 1994, I hosted in Oracle, Arizona, a great name for a little town in the desert, at a place called the Biosphere, which was built by the Bass family in the late 80s. It was an environmental facility that was designed to replicate planet Earth. And
Mm-hmm.
I brought 35 event professionals like yourself there to spend a weekend and to write the first green charter for the meetings and events industry.
Mm-hmm.
And the keynote speaker was a gentleman from Boston, uh, Mr. Saunders, and he was the managing director of the company that owned the Boston Park Plaza Hotel. They were the first hotel in the world to place the signs in the bathrooms that said, leave the towel on the towel rack. If you'd like to reuse it, put it uh, in the bathtub if you wish us to wash the towels, etc. So they were really the first green hotel. And I'll never forget how my cynical friends in the meetings industry listened to him and his speech. And at the end of the speech, they left that room ready to embrace the green agenda. And that charter, which you'll find on the internet, if you just Google Biosphere event charter, you'll see that it includes a very strong commitment towards the development of greening events. So here we are 25 years later. Are we any further along? Well, I would say that the awareness has certainly increased. There is still a lot of greenwashing, there's not a lot of financial investment. But I think until the major players, the major event associations, the major corporations um, teach by doing, we'll still be dragging our feet. Now, interestingly enough, in Europe, over the years, we've been way ahead in
Oh
terms
yeah.
of the green economy initiative. And I think it's because you're dealing with smaller numbers, smaller communities, smaller cities than you have in the United States. So it's easier when you have a smaller ecosystem to make a bigger impact more quickly. And that's the challenge that the States has right now.
Well, it's also cultural, right? In Europe, it's just it's there. I think that they're just further along, and the citizens adopt having this mindset, and caring about the environment. Government, the policies reflect that, right? They're just further ahead in all cases than we are in the U.S. And so I think that that's it just reflects that in our industry. How much we again, it comes down to, like, how much do we care, right? Do we, are we going to do it because because we're killing the planet, or are we, like, just do enough to save a few bucks and then, call it a day. So yeah, I think it's, where does the commitment lie? So this was really interesting to me because I think that folks didn't necessarily answer it in the way that I thought they would, or maybe I didn't convey exactly what I was trying to convey. And or I have another theory on this. So the question was, will you personally be better prepared for another major disruption to in-person gatherings? And so I really wanted people to tell me, like, reflect on, what skills have you gained personally, right? Like, what are you more, agile? Have you adopted, kind of this, idea of disrupting yourself before, you get disrupted, like these kinds of things. But based on the way that, based on this, how they answered here, most people saying, yes, I'm, more prepared, and also in the follow-up notes, the comments people put in, I could tell they're really still focused on what are they doing in their profession, like, so for their company or in their profession. I pulled out one of the comments that kind of covered there was one comment that covered everything people were talking about, contracts, being more frugal, safety guidelines, virtual events, like all those kinds of things. Like, people mentioned all these types of things, that this one person nicely put into one comment for me so I could pull in here. But yeah, I so my other thought here is that, and I'm guilty, like, this is something I've just only recognized in myself recently. We are so, I think, and I love your perspective on this because I know there's a difference here between US and other places too. We're so like emotionally tied to our jobs and, to our industry, that, when asked a question like, will you personally be better prepared, of course I just automatically think, and this is an industry survey, like, I just automatically go to, like, yeah, this is I'm learning how to do virtual events or whatever it is, right, that people respond. And so it was interesting to me to see that, most folks didn't take it to kind of like, what skills am I learning, how can I maybe even leave this industry and change and do something else, right? So what do you think? I know I just gave you a lot to kind of comment on, but what do you think about any of that, Joe?
Well, I think your assumption, your assessment is valid. The reality is, we're in an industry that changes people's lives, starting with our own. Because every time you produce an outcome, and of course the term event comes from the Latin term e venire, which literally means outcome. When you produce an outcome, it fills your heart with joy. It fills your life with joy because you have accomplished something, usually in a very short period of time. Events change the world, one individual at a time, whether it be at a corporate meeting, a association meeting, an exhibition. Lives, a social event, lives are literally changed, transformed by the work of Merlin, the event planner. So your question is about disruption of yourself. I think that people find change very hard, and they also find bad news very hard, especially in my beloved home country of America. They like to move on. That's why you have a short news cycle. People don't want to remember the last murder or the last mass casualty. They want to quickly move on, put it in the back of their mind. That's human nature. I don't think you will change that very soon. And so there is a book called Black Swan Theory by
Mm-hmm.
Nassim Taleb. And in that book, he talks about how these catastrophic events, such as September the 11th, or more recently, the COVID-19 attack, are surprises that we don't expect. And if we can come to terms with what they are going to encompass in our lives, we actually could create something greater as a result of them. And look what you and I have just done today by coming together with StreamYard as our tool. So, in the future, I think that rather than preparing for the next disaster, what people might start doing is thinking about how do I create redundant systems for every event? So, a hybrid approach to meeting and event planning, making certain that I could seamlessly move from the live event to online, um, and have the same quality, high quality online, as I have for the live event in terms of conveying information emotionally, affecting people's lives, etc. So I'm not sure people will always live looking over their shoulder, Elizabeth, wondering about the next disaster coming. What I hope they will do is look to the stars and ask, how can I better improve my practice so that I'm ready for whatever life will bring?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And to kind of, just to wrap up, the last question was about, who do you think the leaders are in our industry? And I've seen this, I'm sure you've seen these too, Joe, in our Facebook group and on other, on LinkedIn and other, other places. Our industry, obviously we're struggling, right? We're not working and we want to be, and there's a lot of these, I guess, calls for our leadership to step up and do something. I'm not sure what the something is yet exactly that we think we want them to do, but the folks that got mentioned, specifically, mostly were MPI, PCMA, and our friend Joan Eisenstadt. And I listed the folks that got listed more than once, but there was a lot of other people, who just got named, got called out at least once. But then just as many folks, I pasted a bunch of these in here, just as many folks said, I don't know who our leaders are. Or, I think that our industry is too dispersed and there's, no easy leaders to point to that are universal for, all of hospitality or events. It's like, I think that the way I look at it, I'm also just struggling with like, what, is our industry just part of tourism and travel and hospitality? It's a small segment of that. Our events, their own industry, are, should we be looking instead at who are we serving? Like, who are our attendees, right? So if you're a corporate planner, and your department falls under the marketing department, right? Like maybe you're in the marketing industry, right, and not in events, and so it's obviously it's very messy, and I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know that I have the answer for what we even want our leaders to do, because they're not going to fix the pandemic, right, which is ultimately, and in the US, right, we obviously have some greater issues going on, and that are going to keep us from meeting for a longer period of time than potentially other parts of the world. So I don't know. So I'm interested in your take, especially since you're not in the US right now, and not dealing specifically with what we're dealing with, with the pandemic. But what do you think about who are our leaders, Joe? Let's start there.
Well, first of all, thank you, Elizabeth. We have similar problems in Europe. Just this week, the Meetings Industry Association, MII of Great Britain, has written a letter to the Secretary of State asking for a meeting to discuss the collapse of the meetings and events industry in Great Britain. Did you hear what I said? Just today.
Yeah.
We're now
Yeah.
in month 4 of this disaster. Why was there a delay? Well, there's a delay because there's too many associations, too many leaders. They compete against one another. Uh, they have different agendas, etc. I've never believed, even when I lived in the United States, that we really represent an industry. I believe that we are an umbrella industry, meaning that we encompass many different fields within meetings and events, expositions, incentives, etc. But we're not a narrow industry, um, such as medicine or law or accounting. We're really an umbrella with lots of little spokes connected to this larger industry. And I think that industry is the events industry. Um, as far as where the leaders are coming from and what they're going to do in the future, you're a few years younger than I am, so I think you'll have a better answer than I will. But I will tell you what my students have told me over the years. They will not be joining associations, they tell me. They will be not be going to conferences, meetings. They will not be sitting at board tables all day. Why? Because they think it's a waste of their time. They will do most of their deliberation online by reading papers, having discussions online. And then if someone has to physically meet to sign a document, they'll get together for a social event and they'll sign those documents. But they're going to find a more efficient, more expedient way to deliberate and to make decisions because they do not see the benefit that I found in my generation of going to meetings and conferences and events and getting to know people. So I don't see that changing. I see it just evolving. I don't think it's a bad thing either because I think young people are brighter today than we ever were. They're more highly educated, more qualified, more experienced. They'll find their own way, but it's certainly going to be different. And that means these 30 meetings and events associations that we have right now might be 15 10 years from now, or even five, because the next generation will find a way to do it better.
Yeah. We actually have over 100. I have a
Yeah,
friend of mine is tracking it, and
yeah.
so I'll tell you my personal story has been very well. It's been very emotional for me, quite frankly. I mean, I was in the industry for 10 years before social media was invented. And, MPI was the one I learned about first. Like, I, figured out I needed to join MPI. I wanted to get my CMP, right? Do all the things, right, that you do when you're, new to the industry. I was so committed to it. I was a huge evangelist of it, and then as you've identified, it's really social media and, web 2.0, even if you will, right? Like changed all of that value proposition, but they have not changed their business models accordingly. And I started to see, like, I'm getting my community online, I'm getting my education online, all of the things that my membership associations provided for me. I didn't need them for that anymore. And I think what you described is even the next kind of evolution of that, right? It's like, why do we meet in person at these big conventions? Being more inclusive, like, when you do things online and virtually, more people are able to show up and participate. And that's something else that's, more important to the younger generations as well. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey for me to see that transition. And I wholeheartedly agree that, their business model, which is, roughly 75% of their revenue comes from their annual conference, right? I mean, we've seen, just in this crisis, we've seen how that's not sustainable, right? Never mind that, right, the value that you're providing, ultimately is just, it's not going to be there. So, um,
It's
yeah, I think.
interesting you say that. When I was in the United States, I did a study of several hundred Washington, D.C. based associations to find out what they believed was the motivation for people attending their events.
Mhm,
And interestingly enough, number one was networking, number two was socialization, etc. When we did the same survey of hundreds of attendees of
mhm,
association meetings, it was the complete converse. They said number one was education. Why?
mhm,
Because their association or their company would pay for them to
right,
go if they achieved education. But that was number one. Yet they weren't really investing in, they were spending thousands, millions on theme parties. They were
right,
spending hundreds of dollars on speakers and education programs. Number two, after education, was uh, professional networking, and that, of course, is linked to education because most education at a conference comes informally when you're having a drink talking about what you've just heard. The third level was recognition, meaning that to win the annual award, the best this, the best that, because again, that helped them with personal promotion, their company's promotion, and so on. The fourth one was the hidden agenda. Now, that was interesting because in the open ended portion of that, when we asked, what do you mean by hidden agenda? They would say, to meet someone of similar interest. Well,
mhm,
that could be professional or it could be romantic. So
Yep, we've
there are
we've seen that
all
happen.
kinds of reasons for meeting face to face.
Right.
So let's look at it now in the 21st century. Education no longer is relevant face to face because it can be delivered just as you've discovered very effectively online, sometimes more effectively. Networking, not as important to get on an airplane, ruin the environment, spend thousands of dollars to travel someplace when we can do as you and I are doing today. So no longer is that a primary motivation for attending a conference. The third, recognition. Well, young people like instantaneous recognition. So online, you finish a module or a course, you get a badge, you get a certificate, and you
Right.
don't have to travel again anywhere to get that kind of recognition. The one thing you can't get is that feeling of applause when you walk across the platform, and that's why live events will always be important. And then the final bit is the hidden agenda. And I think that's an area where event leaders need to tease out a little bit more. And I'm not talking about romance, I'm talking about what are those subliminal, subconscious reasons that people really want to come together. That serendipity, that joie de vivre that brings people together. The
Right.
person who discovers that formula will own the world.
I think you're right. I think that's the magic. Well, this has been great, Joe. I really appreciate you being here. Here's my contact information for anybody that needs it. Joe, do you want to tell the folks where they can find you or where they can connect with you?
Sure. www.joe.goldblatt, Goldblatt. So www.joegoldblatt.scot.
Great. That's awesome. Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks again for your insight and wisdom. I think it's just so amazing that you and I didn't really even know each other at all, and now I know so much about you and your history and what you've provided for the industry. So thank you for that. Thank you for all of that work and elevating our industry. I really appreciate it, and thanks for taking the time to be here today.
My pleasure. And in Scotland, we never finish a meeting without a toast. So this is to you, Elizabeth, with some of our water of life, our beautiful Scottish whiskey. In Scotland, we say not cheers, but we say slanjava, which means to your good health. But when it's with someone we're meeting for the first time and we hope to stay connected with, we say slanjava uhulila nihiknak. And that means in Gaelic, to your great health when I see you and when I don't see you, all the time. Cheers.
Thank you.
Have a good evening when it comes, okay?
Well, yeah, exactly. That's where you're at now. Thanks, Joe.
All right. Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye.